Chapter 16. Rin was unsure if she was more frustrated with the situation with Pyro or with Garrett's refusal to tell her anything. Rin directed the carriage back to the inn and spent the entire ride grumbling under her breath, but Garrett paid her no mind. Instead, he closed his eyes and reached out to the many flowers that dotted the city, checking up on their growth and progress. He had a lot to do, but as he sent his attention ahead to the inn, he couldn't help but sigh. His list would have to wait as visitors had arrived to see him. When he and Rin finally walked into the inn, there were a dozen people in the great room waiting for them. 5 of them were adventurers, led by the guildmaster himself, Arthur Telson. The other 7 were dressed in simple, nondescript clothing, though the strength they exuded was no less than that of the adventurers. Leading them was Louise, the leader of Silversong. The 2 groups weren't quite hostile, but the looks they were giving each other weren't friendly either. Arthur and Louise showed none of the antagonism their subordinates did, and instead were sitting at a table with drinks in hand, chatting casually, as if they were old friends. When they saw Garrett, both of them stood up and greeted him. "I trust this isn't a coincidence," Garrett said, looking back and forth between them. "Actually, it is," Louise said, covering her smile with the fan she carried. Her beautiful eyes peeked at Garrett over top of it as she gestured to Arthur. "I was quite surprised to find Arthur here already, but if I had to guess, it's likely that we're both here for the same thing." "I don't conduct business in the Great Room," Garrett said. "Why don't you come back to my office?" A few minutes later, supplied with a bottle of wine from the cellar, the 3 of them, plus Rin, had settled down in the office. Louise and Arthur each took one of the high-backed chairs, while Garrett sat behind his desk. Rin perched on the windowsill, her eyes scanning back and forth, as she tried to watch both of the people sitting in front of Garrett. Having seen Rin pushing Garrett's wheelchair, both Louise and Arthur assumed that she was a guard of some sort, and promptly ignored her. Neither one of them considered Garrett a threat, and so they were completely relaxed as they poured out the wine that Francis had brought in. Taking a long drink, Arthur smacked his lips and looked at his glass appreciatively. "That's excellent," he said. "It's a vintage from Port Reverie," Garrett replied. "I probably have a couple extra bottles if you'd like some." Grinning, Arthur licked his teeth as he nodded. "That would be wonderful, thank you. The fact that you can get wine from Port Reverie tells me that my trip today is not in vain." "See, I knew we were here for the same reason," Louise said. "Then why don't you go first?" Arthur replied, gesturing with his glass. "Thank you, Arthur. You're always such a gentleman." Maintaining her soft smile, Louise looked across the desk at Garrett. "Just like Arthur here, the reason I've come is to discuss with you the passage you control that leads out of the city. Due to the martial law declared previously, most of the smuggling routes out of the city had to be abandoned, and very few of them have been able to start back up. Silversong deals in all sorts of things, and moving goods in and out of the city is essential for our business. Now that you have ascended to join the 10 seats, I thought it was a perfect opportunity for our gangs to work together. Of course, we won't take advantage of you, and in exchange for free use of your pathway, we'd be happy to support any resolution you might have in the council, so long as it aligns with our interests, of course." "Huh? That's funny," Arthur said. "That is exactly the same proposal I was going to make." "Well, one can never have too many allies," Louise replied, lifting her glass to clink against Arthur's. The entire time they spoke, Garrett remained completely silent, looking back and forth between them as they carried on their conversation. The fact that he hadn't responded didn't go unnoticed, and after a couple more minutes, Arthur and Louise both fell silent, turning their attention on him, before Arthur spoke up once more. "We should discuss what we'll be sending and when, to set up a schedule of sorts. It wouldn't do to clog the passage up too much and cause disruptions." "Exactly," Louise added, still staring directly at Garrett. "After all, both of our gangs have a lot of goods to move." Still, Garrett didn't speak, his gaze just flicking back and forth between the 2 of them every few seconds. His expression was serene, despite the fact that both people sitting across from him were in the Shaper stage, and their auras had slowly begun to extend around them, filling the room with pressure. Garrett, however, seemed completely unaffected, and it wasn't just him. Rin, who was sitting behind him on the windowsill, her eyes narrowed as she stared coldly at the two gang leaders, also seemed to be unaffected. Unable to hide the confusion she felt, Louise peeked at Arthur from the corner of her eyes before putting her almost empty wine glass down on the desk. "You seem concerned by something," she said to Garrett. "Does what we've said not seem fair to you? We wouldn't want to be unfair. But you do owe us," Arthur added. "After all, we're the ones who nominated you to your seat. Without us, you never would have been in this position." For the first time since the conversation began, Garrett's expression changed, as a smile spread across his face and filled his eyes. With considerable amusement, he shook his head. "A favor? You seem to be under a misapprehension. You didn't do me a favor. I did you a favor. If anything, you're the ones who owe me, and not the other way around." His words caused Arthur to take a deep breath and lean forward, his eyes narrowed dangerously. "And how do you figure that?" he asked, a dangerous edge to his voice. "It's a simple calculation," Garrett replied, completely unfazed. "And it goes like this. I didn't want a seat. Otherwise, Sinan, of the Grave Walkers, would have nominated me. Instead, the two of you needed someone to bear the scrutiny of the other gangs, and wanted to force me into direct conflict with the Ebony Association. You achieved your goal by nominating me to this position, and since I already had enmity with Jero, our clash became inevitable. I have solved your problem for you by taking the pressure off of your gangs. That means you owe me, and not the other way around." Furious, Arthur grabbed Garrett's desk and rose to his feet. At the same time, Rin hopped off the windowsill and stood behind Garrett's chair. The only ones who didn't move were Garrett and Louise. Arthur growled as he began to lean over the desk, but before he could say anything, Louise coughed lightly. "Sit down, Arthur." Her voice wasn't loud, but to Garrett's genuine shock, Arthur restrained himself, taking a deep breath and sitting back down in his chair, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. The expression that the mistress of Silversong normally kept on her face was nowhere to be seen, as she stared at Garrett. "Those words you just spoke, can you take responsibility for them?" she asked. "I don't say things I can't take responsibility for," was the calm reply. This caused Louise to smirk. "Then tell me, what sort of agreement do you think would be acceptable? You pay like everyone else. If you want to move goods, let me know, and I can arrange it. The cost depends on what you're moving, in what quantities, and how quickly you need it delivered. Furthermore, at this point, we only handle a delivery outside of the city, not passage through the swamp. Though, we may add that service soon. As for things coming in, we're happy to coordinate that as well for a fee. And here I thought we were friends, Garrett." Returning Louise's smirk, Garrett shook his head. "What on earth gave you that impression? We both know that you didn't elect us to the 10 seats because you had good intentions, but I also don't care what your intentions were. We're more than capable of handling whatever is thrown at us." "You sure about that?" Arthur interrupted, his glare never wavering. "If we were to decide you were an eyesore, the Grave Workers wouldn't be able to save you." "That sounds like a threat to me," Garrett said, returning the Guildmaster's intense glare with a calm and slightly disinterested look. "And if you are in fact threatening us, then we'd be happy to take this to the arena." One of the clear rules of the 10 seats was that the 10 most powerful gangs were not allowed to have direct conflict between their members. This was to keep a massive gang war from breaking out and bringing the city guard's attention down on everyone. Instead, if one of the 10 wanted to solve a conflict with a smaller guild, they were free to do whatever they wanted, but if that conflict was with one of the other 10 seat holders, then the only method they had available was a direct challenge through the arena. This limited the ways that the Klein family could be threatened, and Garrett was more than happy to use it to his advantage. After all, everyone in the room knew that if a challenge was issued, it wouldn't be Garrett they were fighting, but instead Sinan, Death's Flame. Gritting his teeth, Arthur seemed to be struggling to hold back his anger, but a look from Louise kept him silent. "I would urge you to be careful," Louise said to Garrett. Just because we can't declare a gang war doesn't mean there aren't ways that you can be hurt. The growth of your gang has been astounding, but plants without deep roots are liable to wither. Had you been willing to help us out a little bit, it would have gone a long way to generating goodwill. Believe me when I say goodwill is everything. A gang can't survive without monster materials or information. It's better to make friends than enemies, something you seem to have failed to grasp. Besides, while the use of your tunnel would have been most convenient, I'm sure there are others who can assist us as well. That's exactly right, Arthur said. Actually, while we're here, in this part of the city, why don't we go and visit Jero and the Ebony Association? Feigning surprise, Louise drained the rest of her glass. I think that's a great idea, Arthur. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about. Seeing both of them stand up, Garrett tapped a button on his desk, and a moment later, Ob arrived to see them out. You'll excuse me for not seeing you to the door, Garrett said. I'm not quite as mobile as I used to be. The two gang leaders exchanged glances, and then Arthur turned and stalked out. Louise gave Garrett a long look before she left as well, only to find Arthur had stopped in the hallway and was staring in confusion at Francis, who was holding 2 bottles of wine. The boss said these are for you, Francis said, his expression sour. He shoved them into Arthur's hands, turned, and headed for the kitchen, grumbling the whole way. Realizing that these were the 2 bottles Garrett had offered to him, Arthur just stood in the middle of the hallway, looking at them. It was only when he noticed Louise waiting impatiently behind him that he shook his head and left the inn, with Louise following close behind. Neither of them spoke as they got in their respective carriages and left. Garrett, who was watching through the dream flowers planted outside the building, was rather amused when they headed in different directions, neither one going towards the Ebony Association's territory. You know, Dark Raven always said that the best way to keep people from messing with you was to kill a whole bunch of them. It was clear to Garrett that Ren had had quite enough of being threatened and pushed around, and as patient as he was, he found that he was starting to have the same opinion. Just bear it for now, he said. You keep saying that, Garrett, but people are starting to talk. Frowning, Garrett looked at her. What do you mean? We're supposed to be one of the 10 seats now, right? One of the 10 biggest, most important gangs in the city? But why does it feel like we're always watching what we say, not stepping on anybody else's toes? That's not how a gang is supposed to operate. Realizing she was beginning to take out her frustration on Garrett, Ren quickly amended her words. I mean, that's what other people are saying, not what I'm saying, but I do understand their frustration. As do I, Garrett said. But what's the alternative? Should we go and kill everybody? If we gathered all of our awakened together and waged war against the Ebony Association, we could ensure mutual destruction. What would that serve? The best way to fight a war is to win without fighting at all, to preserve as much of the enemy's strength so it can be used to your own benefit. If we were to simply go in and kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, so to speak, we'd be left without a chicken. I'd much rather bide my time and then kill all of the monkeys. The way Garrett said the last phrase caused Ren to shiver. Sometimes she forgot just how cold-blooded Garrett could be. I guess I'm worrying about the wrong person, she said after a moment of silence. If you're telling us to wait, you must have a good reason. Thank you for your trust, Ren. I also appreciate you mentioning this to me. It's important, when leading, that everyone be on the same page. Otherwise, you end up with a bunch of people pulling in different directions, making forward progress impossible. One of the greatest roles of a leader is to align everyone under them in a single direction. Only then can you make true progress. You've pointed out something that we do need to be careful about, so I'll redouble my efforts to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and don't worry, soon enough we'll make our move. Chapter 17. As the clear, cloudless blue sky gave way to the darkness of night, Garrett took his place on the Dreamer's throne, taking a moment to review everything that had happened that day. What stuck out most in his mind was Ren's warning that the people under him were getting a bit restless. Ren was right. As much as Garrett preferred to keep his plans to himself, that could often come across to the family as a lack of direction, which was deadly for any organization. For the first hour of his time in the dream, Garrett used Somnia to send out messages, little feelings and snippets of thought that seeped into the minds and hearts of those who carried dream flowers, reassuring them, comforting them, and reminding them that Garrett had a plan. After that, he began to examine the artifacts brought from Lasric's tomb. A few days prior, during the night when nobody was around, Delrissa had brought them to Garrett's room. She then made her way down through the basement and back into the tunnels. The largest and most obvious of the objects was the obsidian casket that currently lay under a blanket against the wall. It was called Death's Bed and had been used by Agmayoth to extend his life while he absorbed Lasric's power. From what Garrett could understand, the function of the casket was simple. By laying down in it, a body would be preserved exactly as it was when it first entered the casket. If he had guessed correctly, Agmayoth had entered it when he was on his last breath, forever preserving himself on the cusp of death. Had he been fully undead, it would have been impossible for him to master Lasric's power. On the other hand, had he been alive, that same power would have corrupted his flesh, killing him, but by preserving himself in that moment when life transitioned to death, Agmayoth had been able to keep one foot on both sides, learning to wield Lasric's powerful flame. The second artifact Delrissa had brought was the Staff of Bones, a 6.5-foot tall staff whose top was carved into a skeletal arm that held a gleaming black orb. The orb was something Garrett recognized, as he had seen one not so long ago. Karn, the traveling merchant, had actually offered him a soul bead just like this, claiming that it held an uncountable number of souls. Part of the reason Garrett had rejected the offer was because he already had one, though it wasn't yet under his control. The final artifact was an iron grimoire whose pages were fused shut. On the front was a simple skull with glowing green eyes that appeared to Garrett to want to suck out his soul. When he had beaten Agmayoth, one of the options he had gotten was the skill Skeletal Hand, which would have allowed Garrett to select one of Lasric's artifacts, immediately gaining control over it. Garrett hadn't chosen the skill, and while he didn't regret it, he did understand its value. As it was, he was unsure whether he might be able to use the power of the throne to bring the mysterious artifacts under his sway. Ever since Delrissa had brought them to his room, Garrett had been observing them, and wasn't at all surprised to find that the deathly aura that they normally radiated was nowhere to be seen. It was almost absurd, but he got the distinct impression that all three of the artifacts that had been brought into the room were terrified, and had withdrawn the necromantic energy that they normally exuded to avoid angering the throne. The reason Garrett considered it absurd was because mysterious artifacts didn't have intelligence of their own, though the more he pondered that statement, the more suspicious he found it. After all, the throne itself had acted out on more than one occasion, and seemed to carry a sense of pride and authority that could not be challenged. At the same time, even though the three necromantic artifacts were powerful in their own right, because they controlled the energy they gave off, the throne didn't seem to care about them, letting them exist peacefully around it. Tonight, Garrett was interested in testing whether that would remain true if the mysterious artifacts were to be forced into revealing their energy. Of the three, the casket was the one he cared about the least, and so, that's where he began, sending a thread of mental energy into it to try to stimulate its power. Almost immediately, the obsidian casket began to greedily absorb the power he was feeding into it, almost as if it wanted to absorb him. Cutting off the supply of mental energy, Garrett pulled back, but the casket was loath to let him go, and strands of necromantic energy began to spread out, surging towards him as they tried to latch on. What happened next was both expected and positively terrifying. To Garrett, it felt as if an ancient behemoth sleeping under the throne had suddenly awoken, lazily opening an eye and casting a glance at the obsidian casket, which began to shake, softly at first, and then more and more violently. The gaze from the throne was disdainful, as if the casket, for all its power, was less than nothing. The vibration in the casket grew stronger and stronger, until suddenly, with a terrific crack, it shattered into pieces, showering the ground in shards of obsidian. A dense aura of death began to spread rapidly in the room, but the throne glowed bright, unleashing a wave of energy that chewed the dark aura to pieces, before devouring it completely. Garrett, who was sitting on the throne, clinging to the armrest with a white-knuckled grip, swallowed nervously. This was the first time the throne had unleashed this level of power. He had been confident that the mysterious artifact wouldn't be able to overpower the throne, but the discrepancy between their strength caught him off guard. What was most terrifying about the situation, however, was that Garrett had detected a hint of disapproval on the throne, not directed at the now destroyed casket, but instead directed at him. He had no idea why the throne would have disapproved of his actions, but he still bowed his head, silently apologizing in his heart. That seemed to satisfy the throne, and a moment later, another light flashed out, shrouding the obsidian shards on the ground. The light was so bright, Garrett couldn't see, and when it faded a moment later, the casket was back in one piece, though no longer black, but instead a shining, milky white. Drawing in a breath, Garrett stared at it, as a screen popped up in front of him. Soul Crystal Casket, carved from a single piece of the mysterious Soul Crystal. The Soul Crystal Casket can preserve the body of one on the edge of death, allowing them to persist until a cure is found. Immediately, Garrett realized a couple of things. This must have been the original form of Death's Bed, before Lesric's power corrupted it, and whatever intelligence had occupied it was now gone, erased forever. Garrett had a sneaking suspicion that the spirit the throne had erased had been another shard of Agmayoth, a suspicion that was confirmed when he glanced over at the grimoire and saw the glowing eyes of the skull wink out as if afraid. Gesturing, he lifted the lost library of the necromancer into the air and brought it towards him. The closer it got to the throne, the more terrified the skull on the cover seemed to become. Garrett wasn't sure how a skull could show fear, but it conveyed the emotion perfectly. When the metal tome fell into his hand, it seemed to let out a silent shriek. The throne appeared to have gone to sleep again, and not wanting to repeat what had happened earlier, Garrett gathered some of the energy that it naturally exuded and began to draw it in around the tome that he held in his hands. Suddenly, the eyes of the skull snapped back to life, and a wisp of flame emerged from them, shooting towards Garrett. His eyes narrowed dangerously, and he lifted his hand to catch the flame, intending to crush it. Instead, it melted into his palm, causing him to panic slightly. Before he could obliterate the book with the power of the throne, a window obscured his view of the skeleton. The lost library of the necromancer has offered you a soul contract. Accepting it will grant you ownership of Lesric's grimoire, the lost library of the necromancer. As he concentrated on the window, information flooded through Garrett's mind, clearly outlining all of the details around the contract. At its most simple, the contract would bind the spirit to him, transforming it into one of his servants that would operate almost exactly like one of the dream flowers. Garrett's hand paused, a twitch away from obliterating the grimoire and the spirit it contained. While he didn't have any particular interest in necromancy, he couldn't see a downside to this situation, and being able to open the grimoire would ensure that the necromancers under him had access to the spells, as he saw fit, of course. From frightened, the skull on the front of the grimoire had transformed into a pleading look, as if it was terrified of what Garrett, or more likely the throne he sat on, would do to it. After weighing the pros and cons, Garrett nodded and accepted the soul bond. At the same time, he condensed a dream seed, flicking it toward the grimoire. Without hesitating, the skull on the front of the book opened its mouth and swallowed the seed whole. Though Garrett trusted the system, he trusted the flowers he could grow more, and almost immediately, the connection he felt with the grimoire grew even stronger. Opening his hand, he watched as the grimoire rose into the air, its metal cover cracking open and its pages rustling as it flew through the air around him. For a moment, he sat quietly, his eyes closed, as he explored his new connection with the mysterious artifact. As he observed, the grimoire's spirit began to feed its energy into the seed it had swallowed. Soon, flowers began to bloom, first one, then two. At that point, the spirit seemed to hesitate. However, detecting Garrett's cold attention, a third and a fourth quickly followed. Garrett's mercilessness must have made an impression on the spirit, because it didn't stop there. Soon, a fifth had bloomed as well. By this point, the roots of the dream flower had invaded every part of the skull, including the flames that burned in its eyes. Garrett's dream flowers were completely immune to Lesric's flame. Far from damaging the flower, It actually began to pull power out of the fire that burned in the skull's eyes, causing the spirit to start to panic. With a thought, Garrett told the flower to knock it off. He was relieved to see that he had another way to eliminate the spirit if necessary. After that, he began to explore the grimoire, allowing the spirit to feed the information directly into his mind. Arcane symbols that formed complex spells began to filter into his head, as the spirit did its best to convey what the grimoire contained. Eventually, Garrett told it to stop, and the flow of knowledge paused. It took him a while to sort through what he had seen. Once he did, his eyes opened, and he let out a low whistle. The lost library of the necromancer was exactly what it sounded like, a tome that contained thousands upon thousands of necromantic texts. The spirit had no ability to speak, but using what was written in the lost library, it could communicate rudimentary ideas. After questioning it, Garrett found himself stunned. Whoever had created the lost library of the necromancer had been ingenious, tying it directly into Lysric's power, which was the single component that tied all necromancy together. As the god of the dead, Lysric's power was necessary for any necromancer who wished to cast spells. In fact, it wasn't an overstatement to say that necromancy couldn't exist without Lysric. The creator of the grimoire had reverse-engineered this, forging a spell that summoned every tome, journal, or treatise that accessed Lysric's domain. Not only did this create a book that contained all existing knowledge of necromancy that had been written down, but it meant that if new discoveries were made, they too would be added here. Scattered throughout the countless tomes existing inside of the lost library were spells that covered every single aspect of necromancy, from curses to spirit binding to the raising of the dead. The list was completely exhaustive, and sent a shiver down Garrett's spine. Every time he began to feel as if he was powerful, he would discover that he hadn't even yet scratched the bottom of the barrel of what this world had to offer. The spirit infused into the grimoire acted as a librarian of sorts, able to sort through and categorize the information, filling the pages of the book with whatever information its bearer wanted to know. The truth was, Garrett didn't really want to know any of it. Instead, he set the grimoire aside, intending to hand it over to Delrissa the next time she came by. The last artifact was the Staff of Bones, which Garrett assumed had something to do with the raising of the dead and the storing of souls. After probing the staff, Garrett became quite sure that it didn't have a spirit, a fact confirmed by the grimoire, who clearly felt like the superior artifact. Putting the staff aside as well to hand over to Delrissa, Garrett finally turned his attention to his main focus for the evening, beginning the attack against the Ebony Alliance. It started with him calling Isabel from the mirror and sending her flitting through the night toward the Ebony Alliance's territory. One moment, Garrett was sitting on the throne, and the next, he was flying high over the city as he took direct control of her. The night was clear, which he thought was unfortunate, but Isabel's dark hair served well enough to hide her figure, allowing her to blend in with the night sky. To the east of the Klein family territory were two small neighborhoods as well as a double row of houses that sat up against the city wall. This was the territory of the Ebony Alliance, including the large gate that led directly out into the swamp. It was here that the adventurers passed, bringing their goods from the swamp outside into the city. They were headquartered in an old mansion that had once belonged to a petty nobleman. How it came into the Ebony Association's hands was a mystery that few talked about, and from it, the Ebony Association ruled the surrounding neighborhoods with an iron hand. They were a gang that didn't care about territory, as most of their focus was outside of the city, but what gave them their strength was the fact that all of their members were awakened. Chapter 18 At 200 strong, the Ebony Association formed a veritable army, and no one, including the Adventurers Guild, wanted to squabble with them. Additionally, they were one of the wealthiest gangs in the city, as they had a near-complete monopoly on any material that could be found in the swamp. Garrett had Isabel touch down on the roof of the manor, staying there for a moment to observe. As night had fallen, there weren't many people coming and going, though occasionally he would see a team leaving the manor for one of the surrounding buildings, no doubt to get some sleep. As quick as a shadow, Garrett used Isabel's ability to enter reflections to jump to one of the adventurers leaving the building, and then jumped again to a window on the first floor. He had never been inside the manor before, and so had no idea what sort of layout it might have. From the front window, he could see into the main hall, a large, grandiose affair with a staircase that rose 2 stories. The decorations were old and clearly in need of repair, but there was enough shine to the decorations on the wall that Garrett had no trouble bouncing from object to object as he headed up the stairs towards the 2nd floor. He assumed that he would find his target on either the 2nd or 3rd floor, and for the next hour, he zipped this way and that, bouncing from one shining object to another as he got a good sense for the layout. Along the way, he didn't forget to scent dream seeds to lodge themselves in the bodies of anyone he saw. Only Jero, out of the entire gang, was in the shaper stage, at least to his knowledge. This meant everyone else was practically defenseless. Once he had completely covered the 2nd floor, Garrett controlled Isabel to head up to the 3rd, continuing his search until he stumbled across what appeared to be Jero's office. It was a simple enough matter for Isabel to slip through the locked door, transferring from one side of the door handle to the other, through the lock itself. Seeing that nobody was inside, he had her manifest. She appeared as if out of thin air, her long hair floating mysteriously around her, her feet a few inches off the ground. For a moment, she remained in place as Garrett slowly looked around, checking for any traps or anything that might be harmful. When nothing was immediately apparent, he moved toward the desk and began to peruse it. He found the gang's ledgers and looked through them, his eyebrows rising as he saw just how much money the Ebony Association made every month. It was more than enough to pay the Klein family's expenses twice over, causing Garrett to be quite happy. With his curiosity satisfied, Garrett decided it was time to get to work for real. A moment later, everything around him shifted as Isabel moved into the dream. One of the advantages of Shaper-level nightmares was their ability to enter and exit the dream at will. Most didn't have the intellect to do so, but those that did were truly terrifying. Garrett had never been to this part of the dream before, and so, as he looked around, everything was covered by a dense fog. With a wave of his hand, his power covered the room, sweeping away the fog to reveal the appearance of the manor. It was old and dilapidated, with peeling wallpaper, a sagging ceiling, and thick dust covering everything. Looking around for a moment, Garrett controlled Isabel to go out into the hall, almost immediately running into a pack of drudge wraiths. With silent hisses, the drudge wraiths shook in fear and tried to dart away, but Garrett was on them too quickly, tearing them apart with sharp claws, even as others were picked up with hair and crushed. Before he continued on, Garrett turned and began to send out dream flowers. As he did, he could feel his experience dropping. 432, 431, 430. Every time he created a seed and filled it with power, his experience would drop by 1. But Garrett didn't care. If this operation was successful, he knew that he would gain exponentially more experience than he lost. All night, Garrett moved through the Ebony Association's base, planting flowers and eliminating nightmares. By the time he was done, he had spent over 300 experience points, reducing him to only 110 out of the 640 that he needed. Still, he didn't begrudge it at all, as by now, his enemy's base was completely covered in dream flowers. Dawn wasn't far away when he finally finished. He controlled Isabel to leave the building, looking back with a smile that stretched from ear to ear behind the long hair that fell over Isabel's face. Propagate. Excited by his command, the dream flowers shook, and Garrett vanished, releasing Isabel to return on her own. As he opened his eyes and looked to the east with a cold smile, he knew it would have been much faster for him to directly control each of the awakened, taking over their minds by forcefully growing the dream flowers he had planted. He had a sneaking suspicion, however, that such an action would be noticed. In any case, the true terror of the dream flowers was their ability to stealthily infiltrate through the dream, planting seeds in those unaware of their existence and slowly growing them until they had taken control. Sending a command to Sonia, his overlord flower, to keep tabs on what was happening, Garrett left the dream and began to plan the second stage of the hostile takeover. Dealing with the awakened members of the Ebony Association was one thing, but dealing with Jero Twinblade was going to be entirely another. The possibility of being able to take over Shaper Stage Awakened was very low. It had only worked with Simon because she had voluntarily given up control, embracing the guardian seed that had once been Viper. Isabel's capture had been possible because she was a nightmare, and thus less resistant to the fusion of mental energy required to bond with a dream flower. Jero, on the other hand, would be next to impossible to capture and convert, which meant that he really only had one other option, and that was elimination. There were a lot of ways that Garrett could think of to get rid of Jero, but each time he settled on a plan, he hesitated, as he would have rather had her as an ally than an enemy. Additionally, if the Ebony Association lost their only Shaper, it would completely destabilize their position on the Council of 10 seats, which wouldn't serve Garrett either. The plan he had finally settled on was rather daring, and Garrett wasn't sure if he was going to succeed. Still, if it worked, it would be better than just killing her. For the next week, Garrett and the Klein family laid low. Princess Eloise was in and out of the inn almost every day, meeting with nobles whom Baron Galavin had vetted as loyal supporters of the crown. Garrett had sent the workers from the factory back to Caraway, where they pitched in as they were able to try and get the factory back up and running. He had to reassure Rin a dozen times that he did, in fact, have a plan, and that it was currently in progress. About halfway through the week, at Princess Eloise's request, Garrett finally reached out to his father, sending a carefully worded handwritten note informing his father that he was still alive and would like to meet. Most importantly though, Garrett spent the week monitoring the situation at the Ebony Alliance. With Somnia's oversight, the flowers there had begun to propagate at an almost alarming rate. Any space where Awakened often gathered tended to be rich in mental energy, and every time he directed his attention towards the old mansion, it seemed that hundreds more blooms had appeared. Garrett was also satisfied to see that the flowers had begun to plant themselves in the awakened members of the gang. None of them were above 3 flowers yet, but Garrett knew that with time, 4 and 5 blooms were inevitable. There was another benefit, as the density of the flowers provided a sort of beacon for the awakened dreamers, who worked hard to clear the territory between Dreamers Inn and the old mansion. Once, this had been the territory of Agmayoth, but with his death, it had become unclaimed, and Garrett had little trouble sweeping it up. Even as the awakened dreamers ranged out from Dreamer's Rest, cutting through the fog and eliminating nightmares, Isabel did as well, targeting all of the Shaper or near Shaper level nightmares hidden in the territory. They had found 3 greater nightmares, all of whom were warring with each other to try and become the next ruler of the area. Without a shred of mercy, Isabel devoured each in turn, relying on Garrett's abundant mental energy and the mysterious artifacts she had collected to overpower each of them. Soon, she was the only greater nightmare in the Ebony Association's territory, and Garrett was assured that there wouldn't be any interference as he began the next step of his plan. It started simply with a rare stroll through the dream. By this point, flowers had been planted along the streets, forming a long path that led out to the Ebony Association's headquarters. Accompanied by Isabel, Garrett made the journey right after the sun had fallen on the 5th day. The only witnesses were lesser nightmares, too dumb to be afraid of Isabel, who floated behind him. But if anybody had seen him, he imagined it would have been a strange sight, watching a man in a suit with a mask on his face and a bowler hat on his head stroll down the street, hands in his pockets, as if he had not a care in the world, while a terrifying, dire spirit with long hair that moved like snakes floated along behind him. When he finally arrived at the mansion, he paused for a moment to look it over. There were flowers everywhere, and though there weren't quite as many as at the inn, it was still an impressive sight. A faint feeling of goodwill swept towards him as the flowers sensed his presence and their petals shifted happily. As he entered, the sound of Garrett's feet on the marble floor echoed throughout the empty space, causing a ripple in the watching flowers. Heading upstairs, Garrett saw dozens of awakened, all bearing dream flowers. He stopped to examine a few of them, nodding in satisfaction when he saw how vibrant the flowers they carried were. Continuing on, he walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, found Jero's office, and stopped right outside the door. As his hand reached for the handle, he paused, mentally reviewing his plan. After reassuring himself that it really was the only viable way to produce a positive solution, Garrett took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped into the room. Jero sat at her desk, a deep frown on her face and her brows furrowed. An open bottle of wine stood next to her, along with a full glass, untouched. She was currently looking at her account books, and though Garrett couldn't see them, he knew exactly what they said. Material harvested from the swamp was beginning to pile up in the Ebony Association's territory, and if it wasn't sold soon, much of it would begin to go bad. Most monster material had to be processed in a timely manner, or it would rot, making it unusable. This was a particular problem, because while the Ebony Association's income was significant, so were their expenses. The problem was that Giannis Manor lay to the south, blocking their path to the market by water. The grave workers held the territory to the north, making it impossible for them to pass through the graveyard, and their prime avenues to the market, which would allow them to take their goods directly to sale, were currently occupied by the Klein family. Jero knew that she would have to force the issue at some point, but when she did, she was liable to be attacked from multiple sides, turning what had been a careful skirmish into an ugly scuffle. She was wary of reducing her gang's power any further, as she knew there were multiple forces waiting in the wings to take over the lucrative monster material business, if she showed any sign of weakness. Garrett stood behind her in the dream, carefully observing her, as his power gently washed away the fog that surrounded the room. When he had first entered the dream, bringing anything into focus required him to expend the majority of his energy. As a shaper, however, his very presence caused the fog to slowly peel back. Knowing that if he was too aggressive about it, Jero would sense him, Garrett made sure to work slowly, trying to avoid touching her body with his energy as much as possible. Once the fog was mostly clear, all that was left was for Garrett to wait, which is exactly what he did, standing silently behind Jero, until, at around 1 in the morning, she yawned, gave her account books a disgusted look, and drank down the wine she had been ignoring all evening in great gulps. Garrett followed her to a small room off of the office, where she collapsed into bed, having spent a fruitless evening trying to figure out the best course of action. Ever since her plan to trap him had failed, she seemed to have grown much more cautious, which Garrett honestly couldn't blame her for. After all, according to legend, Kabod's maze was not something someone should be able to return from. Yet after only a day, Garrett was back in the inn, fine and fit as a fiddle. Had he been in her place, he would have been just as cautious. Exhaustion must have weighed heavily on Jero, because after only a few minutes, her breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep sleep. Garrett, standing next to her bed, slowly reached out and touched her, infusing a tiny spark of energy into her, as he pulled her sleeping mind into the dream. It had been a considerable amount of time since he had forcefully pulled another person into the dream, but he found it easier than ever. Jero's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, she remained absolutely still, her eyes shifting this way and that. She could tell that something was strange, not right, but what it was eluded her. She was still in her bedroom. Everything appeared to be exactly the same. Slowly, she sat up, scanning the room as she tried to pinpoint the cause of her unease. When she saw the closed door and the soft light beaming under it, her eyes narrowed, and she stealthily got out of bed, grabbing her swords that lay next to her. Chapter 19. On quiet feet, she slipped over to the door and carefully eased it open, peeking through the crack into what should have been her office. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw something else entirely. It was a wide hall with tall pillars that rose until they vanished into the mist that hung above the chamber. The ground was formed from gleaming stone that seemed to shift and change under her eyes. At one moment, it was simple flagstone, and the next, it transformed into wondrous mosaic patterns. Long banners hung between each of the pillars, their tops invisible, fluttering lightly in a breeze that Jero couldn't feel. In front of each banner was a high-backed chair, with mysterious symbols carved in the center. "Come in," the solemn voice pulled at Jero's heart. In a trance, she opened the door and stepped into the large hall. She counted a dozen chairs, 6 on each side, leading up to a dais where a 25-foot-high golden throne appeared. A massive figure sat in it, whose features couldn't be distinguished, and whose every motion carried a mysterious meaning that left Jero's mind trembling. A few of the high-backed chairs also had figures in them, though each was blurry and impossible for Jero to make out. Convinced that this must be a dream, Jero looked around with wonder. Approach. The next thing she knew, Jero was standing in front of the dais, looking up at the massive giant on the throne. The longer she stared, the more mysterious the figure seemed. Every shift of the giant's body caused myriad colors to spring to life and swirl around the throne, but strangely, Jero couldn't feel any sort of pressure. It was as if the figure in front of her didn't exist. "Thank you for answering my summons," the giant said, his words echoing, filling the hall. "Who are you?" As soon as she asked the question, Jero blanched, but the giant didn't seem to take offense. "I am the dreamer on the throne," he said, his voice solemn, "and I have come to see if you are worthy of an opportunity." With a wave of his hand, the giant caused the mist around the chairs to pull back, allowing Jero to see their true appearance, and more importantly, who sat on them. The closer to the giant's throne, the more ornate the chairs were, and the more impressive the banners that hung behind them. Staring as she looked around, Jero's eyes narrowed when she caught sight of a number of people she recognized. The two seats closest to the throne were empty, but the seats in the second position were both full. One was a mysterious-looking woman whose hair hung over her face, giving the wide smile revealed behind it a chilling feeling. Across from her sat Sinan, Death's Flame, who stared at Jero through the band that covered her eyes. The next set of chairs were occupied as well, and Jero recognized Garrett's figure immediately, despite the fact that he was wearing a red mask with a flower on it. The other chairs were occupied by individuals wearing that same mask, and a few of them gave Jero a familiar sense, as if able to sense the hostility that rose in her heart when she saw her enemies. The giant chuckled, his voice pulling Jero's attention back to the front of the room. "There is a world beyond the world you see, a place where battles are fought on a scale you cannot even begin to imagine. It is here that I would invite you, to serve as one of my generals, to carry out my will in the dream." Despite Jero's initial impulse to deny him outright, she considered the giant's words. Like every single one of the 10-seat holders, Jero was ambitious. After all, how else would she have built the Ebony Association into what it was, without ambition? The giant remained silent, waiting for her to speak. And when she did, it wasn't a rejection, but instead a question. "If I were to join you, what would I get?" Jero got the impression that the giant was smiling at her, and his response seemed to prove it. "One of the things I appreciate about you is your courage," the giant said, "but you would do well to add a bit of respect to your tone." When he said the word respect, Jero felt the room change, as an unimaginable power locked onto her soul, promising to crush her in an instant, if she did not do as she was told. The feeling was gone almost as fast as it came, but it left Jero gasping for breath, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Do not misunderstand me," the giant continued, in the same pleasant tone. "I do not prefer to win others over through coercion. But should you deny me the respect I deserve, I will end you in an instant. Now, to the benefits. After all, any position of responsibility should come with equal reward. The first is protection. Protection from threats beyond what your mortal mind can comprehend. Protection from powers you have no way of combating." The giant appeared to gesture a swirl of color, tracing his movement. Glancing over her shoulder, Jero saw that he was pointing at Garrett. Immediately, she understood. This was the being who had saved Garrett, bringing him safely out of the inescapable trap she had sent him into. Just this alone was enough for Jero to consider joining, as she had been secretly terrified that what she had done to Garrett, he would in return do to her. After all, the fact that he had escaped from Kabod's maze seemed to indicate that he knew how to use the device, which had forced her to be on her guard every waking moment. "But that isn't all," the giant continued, as if oblivious to her turmoil. "If you serve me, you will find opportunity to grow in strength, beyond what you know possible. You believe yourself to be at the top, to be unmatched in your level of power. But you have no idea of the truth of this world. Beyond the mortal coil lie powers you could never fathom, powers that could shift the very fabric of reality. As he spoke, the giant waved his hand, and suddenly, they were no longer in the hall, but instead on a mountain top, overlooking a vast, rugged landscape. The giant's throne sat atop the peak, as if he were the ruler of the world. Turning around, Jero stared at the wondrous view, drawing in a deep breath of cold mountain air. As she blinked, the scene changed once more, returning to the stone hall. Yet she knew that what she had seen hadn't been a figment of her imagination, as she could still feel the cold air in her lungs. "With reward comes responsibility," the giant said, his voice still light. "And what I offer you is true responsibility. Those I have gathered in this place serve me in various roles, and have varying degrees of influence. To you, I would offer a special role, the role of chosen." Turning around to face the giant once more, Jero saw him flick his finger, and something flew up from one of the empty chairs nearest to the throne. It was a golden mask, completely smooth, save for 2 holes for her eyes. Marked on it was a 5-petaled flower, dyed in the colors of the rainbow. A chosen is a direct representative, imbued with a fraction of the power I wield. The mask was cool to her touch, and as Jero stared down at it, she could feel a faint sense of weight, almost as if the mask contained a bit of that pressure she had felt a few minutes earlier. "If I accept this position," Jero said, after a moment of thought, "will I be under them?" Seeing her gesture to Sinon and Garrett, the giant chuckled, his voice causing the banners to shake. "No, the chosen bear a special position, but likewise, you will not be over them. Those who serve me are under but one, and over the uncountable mass each has their own role to play. Everyone has their own tasks, and while you may occasionally be asked to assist, you will not be under anyone save me." Truthfully, Jero didn't know what to think about all of this. She had never encountered anything like this in her life, and the thought of gaining access to greater power was appealing. At the same time, it would mean joining her enemies, which would come with a loss of face and the weakening of her gang. As soon as the thought appeared, she realized that there would be a significant problem. After all, even if she accepted this mysterious figure's offer, it was unlikely that all of her men would be willing to follow her as well. They were currently geared up for a war against the Klein family, and potentially even the Grave Walker gang. "I am not an unreasonable ruler," the giant said, giving Jero the impression that she had been seen through, "and so I will give you a demonstration of my power. Should you wish to accept my offer, simply place the mask on your face. I will give you a week. If you have not made your decision by then, I will make your decision for you." With those ominous words, the dream ended, and Jero sat up in her bed, a lingering pressure causing her lungs to constrict. It was dark in the room, and as she fumbled for her swords, her hand touched something cool and smooth, causing her to freeze. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she gazed down and caught sight of a faint golden gleam. The mask the mysterious figure had given her in the dream was now sitting next to her on the bed. What she couldn't see was Garrett standing next to her bed in the dream, just out of arm's reach. This was the second step in Garrett's plan, and one that was a huge gamble. Ever since he had gained the Dream Ruler class, he had been given the opportunity to appoint 2 chosen. These were beings who would gain a fraction of his power, growing with him as he grew, and in return, with the authority the position granted, they would have some control over his forces, making it possible for him to delegate tasks and have them carry them out on his behalf. Additionally, the chosen could act as his eyes and ears, and he could communicate with them across any distance. In reality, Garrett didn't actually need the positions, as next to all of the benefits that such a position brought could be replicated via the dream flowers. The problem was that he wasn't yet strong enough to plant dream seeds and shape her stage awakened. He would have much preferred simply taking Jero over with dream flowers, ensuring her undying loyalty. But in lieu of that, this was his next best option, attempting to lure her into work for him, promising her benefits, and aligning her interests with his. Garrett wasn't naive enough to believe that the sight of the mask in the waking world would be enough to convince her, which is why it was time to begin Stage 3. As he doubted Jero would get any more sleep that night, Garrett left, leaving Isabel to lurk nearby as he returned to the inn. constructing the dream and all of the characters in it had taken a tremendous toll on Garrett, and when he finally made it back to his room, he collapsed into bed, quickly falling asleep. He was so exhausted, he didn't wake until well after breakfast, when Rin knocked on his door to check on him. It was clear from the look on her face that she wasn't actually concerned about him, but instead was bursting with excitement and really wanted to share some news that she had heard. "Garrett, you would not believe this," she said, pacing back and forth as he blinked at her sleepily from his bed. "Do you know that swamp rot epidemic that has been going around? Well, it just got worse, way worse. There have been 4 hot spots in our district, but there are rumors that it's even hit the nobles." Slowly, Garrett pulled himself into a sitting position and gestured towards his dresser. Without missing a beat, Rin opened the drawers and grabbed him a shirt, even as she continued to talk. They tried to hush it up, but apparently it's just been getting worse and worse. It got so bad that they had to call in the exorcists to investigate, fearing that it was some sort of curse. You would never believe what they found. It's not a curse at all. There's something wrong with... Rin suddenly paused, her excited expression transforming through half a dozen emotions in rapid succession before settling into complete shock as she lifted a trembling finger to point at Garrett. "There's something wrong with Paro's soap," Garrett finished helpfully as he shrugged out of his nightgown and slid on his shirt. "Is that what you were going to say? How did, ooh." Even as she asked the questions, Rin's mind put together all of the pieces, finally understanding what the giant pit Garrett had constantly been talking about actually was. "You know, it's not hard to make soap," Garrett said, "but one does have to be careful about what they put into the mixture." Sliding himself into his chair, Garrett had Rin, who was still in complete shock, wheel him into his office. Once there, he got out a slip of paper and handed it to her. "This is a recipe. Please bring it to Caraway and have him begin producing soap as fast as possible using it." Reaching over the desk, Rin took the note, glancing at it, and then shaking her head. "This was why we went to visit all those alchemists, right? When you were asking about swamp rot." "Correct. When Paro took our production methods, he also took our material. A material that has a specific component that I wanted to test to see if it would work for improving the texture and lather of the soap. Unfortunately, Avernus wheat extract reacts poorly with tobacco and a number of other things. The result being that anyone who uses Paro's fine soap will likely find themselves breaking out with swamp rot, no matter how many times they go to the healers. Thankfully, there's a neutralizing agent, which is in the recipe you're holding. It is of vital importance that you have Caraway personally take samples of the soap to all of those who are suffering from swamp rot. A few days of use should eliminate the oil from the Avernus wheat from their skin, after which it'll only be a matter of days until they heal." "Won't Paro guess what we did?" Rin asked, her eyes bright. "He can guess all he wants," Garrett said, a slow smile creeping across his face. "But when we went to warn him that what we were producing in his factory wasn't actually tested, he refused to see us." "I'm glad I'm on this side," Rin said abruptly. And then, with a laugh, she ran out of the room, clearly excited to deliver the recipe to Caraway. Chapter 20. Turning his chair, Garrett looked out of the window, gazing into the street, his mind turning the situation over and over. He could practically guarantee Paro's response to the situation, but it wouldn't matter. When word began to spread that Paro's fine goods had produced soap that gave the people who used it swamp rot, the most likely outcome would be Paro's fine goods losing the bulk of their customers. Garrett knew all too well how fickle the human heart was, which was part of the reason that he wanted to send Caraway to give soap for free to the afflicted customers. After all, none of them had asked to be part of the conflict between him and Marcus Paro. Paro would, of course, try for damage control. And when that failed, and the pressure on him grew too great, he would undoubtedly send someone after Garrett's life. The only question was, should Garrett strike preemptively, nipping the threat in the bud? After thinking through the pros and cons, Garrett made up his mind and then turned his attention to the accounts, working through all of the reports piled up on his desk. That night, he was as busy as always. But the first thing he did was visit a certain city guard commander. Captain Furnick had been promoted to Commander Furnick and had been given authority over all of the guard stations in the Northern District. It was a position that on the surface had considerable power. However, Furnick had been disappointed to discover that, in reality, he was little more than a glorified messenger, taking directions from above and distributing them to the various captains who ran the watch houses. He was just reflecting bitterly on how the only thing all his effort had gained him was an extra badge when Garrett pulled him into the dream. Nothing around the captain changed except for a 5-cauliflower that bloomed in the mirror, transforming into the image of a masked man who regarded the terrified captain evenly. Swallowing, Captain Furnick bowed. "Hello, sir." "No need for that," Garrett said, waving his hand. "I understand that you're discontent with your position, but just be patient. You may be surprised at what it offers you." Garrett's words caused a thrill of excitement to run through the captain, and he perked up, paying careful attention to what Garrett said next. "One of our benefactors is concerned over the recent epidemic and wishes the perpetrator to be brought to justice. Marcus Parrow, of Parrow's Fine Goods, has been selling soap that causes the users to break out in swamp rot. Such a thing is an affront to the nobles of our city, especially when he has the audacity to sell it for such an exorbitant price. Take him into custody, under charge of colluding with outsiders to undermine the strength of this city." The charge Garrett listed was just as silly as what he had once been brought to prison for by Captain Furnick, a truth that wasn't lost on the commander. Still, he took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll go first thing in the morning," he said. "Better to wait till 10, Garrett replied. "After all, the bigger the crowd, the better." With that, he vanished, leaving Commander Furnick to figure out how to carry out his orders. True to his word, the captain arrived at the appointed time. Commander Furnick had organized 3 watch houses, dragging them all to Marcus Parrow's mansion early in the morning and staking out the building to ensure that the merchant wouldn't have the opportunity to run away. Ever sensitive to the presence of the city guard, the local citizenry could tell that something was going to go down, and as time dragged on, more and more of them gathered. Still, the guard didn't make a move until finally Marcus Parrow couldn't stand it anymore and threw open his door, marching straight up to the commander to ask him what in the blazes was going on. His face as cold as stone, Commander Furnick gestured, and one of the captains stepped forward and began to read the charges. Garrett had suggested treason, or at least collusion with forces outside of the city. The commander had taken the charge and gotten wildly creative, producing a list of almost 17 crimes, all linked to the soap that Parrow had sold and the ill effects it had brought. He had dug up obscure laws originally intended to help stop the spread of disease and cited multiple legal precedents under which a merchant could be held responsible for the harm his goods caused. As soon as the list began to be read, Parrow tried to stop it, but Commander Furnick gestured and 2 burly city guards grabbed the protesting merchant. When he wouldn't be quiet, Furnick had him gagged, tied up, and carried to the jail wagon to be carted off to the prison. After that, streams of the city guard forced their way into Parrow's house, intimidating the servants and seizing anything that looked like it could be remotely connected to Parrow's business. It was a testament to Marcus Parrow's connections that, within 10 minutes of being grabbed, multiple nobles filed complaints against Commander Furnick in the whole proceedings, complaints which he completely ignored, claiming that he was working in the city's best interest. As things began to heat up, however, the captain quickly found himself getting out of his depth. He was in his office, being roundly scolded by 3 noblemen, when one of his men knocked on his door, a strange expression on his face. "Excuse me, sir." Taking the opportunity to escape from the nobleman's ranting, Commander Furnick got up and swiftly walked to the door where the guard was standing. "Yes, what is it?" "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but we have someone who wants to confess." Furnick's forehead furrowed as uncertainty filled him. "Confess? Confess about what?" Swallowing, the city guard glanced at the nobleman, whose expressions had gone pale, and stepped aside, revealing a thin man with a small mustache and a permanent sneer on his face. With a flourishing bow, he addressed Commander Furnick. "I am Boris Gibbons," he said in his high-pitched voice, "one of the overseers who works for Parrow's Fine Goods, Still confused about what was happening, Commander Fernick watched as Boris straightened, a faint rainbow flash appearing briefly in his eyes. "I've come to turn myself in and to reveal the immoral truth behind Marcus Parrow's business practices." "What is this?" Hearing an angry shout from one of the noblemen behind him, Commander Fernick turned around and fixed the man with a glare. "Do not get in the way of the city guard doing its job, or you may well just find yourself in the same position as Mr. Parrow." Before the nobleman could protest, another city guard ran in. "Sir, someone else has come forward." Every eye turned towards the doorway, where Parrow's butler now stood. Noticing a familiar gleam in the old man's eyes, Captain Fernick suddenly laughed, all of his worries about the repercussions for what he was doing evaporating under the rainbow glow that flashed across the butler's eyes. Though Garrett was nowhere near the prison, he had Somnia keep an eye on what was happening, sending him updates as the situation developed. It had always been in his mind to use Parrow's own people to expose the man's misdeeds, and it had been as simple as directing Somnia to plant seeds in the overseer and butler. In many ways, his overlord Flower operated as an extension of himself, acting almost as another mind that could be set to tasks independently, problem-solving and coming up with solutions as necessary. Even as everyone was watching what was happening with Parrow and Miss Soap, Garrett's attention was mostly focused on Jero Twin Blade and the Ebony Association. With every day that passed, the flowers that had taken root in the Ebony Association's members grew, increasing Garrett's connection with them and slowly beginning to influence them to have a positive attitude toward the Klein family. On the third day after he had visited Jero and performed the show, in her dream, Garrett called Rin and requested that she accompany him over to the Ebony Association headquarters. They didn't bring anybody else with them, at least anybody that could be seen. As was his normal practice, Garrett had a swarm of flower ghouls hiding underground, along with Delrissa and a few of her necromancers, and Isabel hitched a ride on a silver ring he wore on his thumb. The fact that a gang leader had just walked into another gang's territory completely unannounced, with no visible protection, startled everyone who heard it, and Jero, who had been examining the latest batch of goods brought into their warehouses, hurried back to the mansion to meet him. She was afraid that some of her men, in their frustration, might act out. But when she got there, she found them all chatting happily. A few of the men had confused expressions on their faces, as if they weren't quite sure why they were having such a good conversation with Garrett. But every time they thought about taking him hostage, they found themselves swept with a strong aversion to anything of the sort. When Jero arrived, breathing heavily from her run, she was met by a loud wave of laughter as the adventurers laughed at one of Rin's jokes. Garrett, who had been mostly quiet, had Rin wheel him forward and bowed from the waist. "Greetings," he said, his voice soft. "I'm here to deliver something to you." He took out a single sheet of paper that had been sitting beside him and held it out to Jero, whose eyes widened as she read over it. It was a simple agreement, granting the Ebony Association full rights to bring their goods through the Klein family territory, without having to pay any sort of fee. What was even more startling, however, was that it wasn't just signed by Garrett, but also bore sign and signature as well, written so that it looked like she was guaranteeing the authenticity of the document. Down in the corner was a simple symbol of a 5-petaled flower, shimmering in rainbow color. Ever since experiencing that vivid dream, Jero had not been able to get the sight of that symbol out of her head, and even now she could feel the golden mask she had tucked into her clothing, pressing up against her skin. With his delivery done, Garrett bowed again, and then asked Rin to escort him out, leaving Jero standing there, staring at the paper that had just solved her biggest problem. "Wait," Jero called out as Rin pushed Garrett out into the yard. "Hold on." She came striding out after them, her eyes blazing. Feeling the pressure Jero exuded, Rin tensed, her hand drifting towards her dagger. Garrett, on the other hand, just gazed calmly at the leader of the Ebony Association, waiting for her to speak her mind. "Who is he? What is this?" Giving Jero a faintly disapproving look, Garrett shrugged. "That is a free pass to bring your goods through our territory without having to pay any fee. As for why you're holding it, it's because I was instructed to give it to you." Shifting slightly in his chair, The cloth covering Garrett's legs moved to the side, revealing a sliver of crimson red. Spotting it, Jero realized it must be one of the crimson masks, just like the mask Garrett's figure had worn in the dream. "The figure on the throne," Jero said, her voice growing quiet. "Who is he?" "Not someone whose name should be spoken," Garrett replied curtly. "Someone whose power is beyond anything you can imagine." Without saying anything further, he gestured for Rin to bring him to the carriage. As they rode out of the yard, he glanced back through the window and saw Jero was still standing in front of the mansion, the contract in her hand. As he turned and looked forward, he caught sight of Rin's glare, and slowly his eyebrows rose. "Is something the matter?" he asked. "It feels like it, even though I know it's not," Rin replied, her voice snappy. "I'm sure you're going to tell me it's all part of the plan. Problem is, I don't know anything about the plan, and from where I'm sitting, it looks like we just gave the enemy a major win." "Who said that they were the enemy?" Garrett asked. Opening her mouth to retort, Rin couldn't find any words, and finally just shook her head. For most of the rest of the ride, they were quiet, but as they were pulling into the yard of the Dreamers Inn, Garrett finally spoke. "There will be a day when we have an unassailable position. But until then, what we need more than anything else are allies. Allies who won't betray us. Allies who will fight alongside us in times of desperate need. Allies who can watch our back even as we watch theirs. The Grave Walkers are one such organization. I think that the Ebony Association may be as well. What we are doing right now is investing with the hope that they will join us." "And if they don't?" Rin asked. "What happens if they just take advantage of that agreement?" Glancing out the window at the inn's door, Garrett shrugged. "Then they no longer need to exist." Back at the Ebony Association's headquarters, Jero was still standing on the steps, her expression unreadable as she stared down at the piece of paper in her hand. "Hey, boss." Hearing a voice behind her, she turned and saw one of her lieutenants staring at her in some confusion. "What is it?" Scratching his head as if he didn't understand what it was he was about to do, he spoke carefully, as if thinking about each word before he uttered it. "Boss, I've got this strange feeling I'm supposed to give you a message." "A message? What kind of message?" Pascal chose poorly." "Yeah, Pascal chose poorly. That's it." As soon as she heard those words, another voice echoed in Jero's mind. It was the words said by the mysterious giant on the throne, just before the dream had ended. At the time, she hadn't taken it to be a threat, but now, hearing what her lieutenant was saying, the words seemed to shift in their meaning. If she didn't choose within a week, the giant would choose for her. The words conjured an image of Pascal's broken neck from the depths of her memory, and a slight shudder ran through her. She had never liked Pascal, and was actually glad that he had died. Their alliance had been one of convenience, not preference, but the way he had been killed had been upsetting. His strength was on par with almost every shaper in the city. Yet he had been killed without even getting a chance to fight back. His neck snapped like a twig. With one last look down the street where Garrett's carriage had disappeared, Jero turned and headed into the old mansion, the distinct feeling that everything was beginning to close in around her weighing heavily on her. Tope continued,